Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of American history in the period 1920 to 45. In the previous lectures, we've looked at some of the social and cultural conditions in the country as we head into the early 1920s, including things like the Red Scare and the prominence of nativism. In this next series of lectures, we're going to be looking at the political climate in the country and talking about the presidencies of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, starting with this first series of lectures about Warren G. Harding. On March 4th, 1921, Woodrow Wilson rode with Warren G. Harding from the White House to the Capitol for Harding's inauguration. Wilson was aged and infirm. We've talked previously about the stroke that he had survived a year earlier. Harding, on the other hand, looked majestic, healthy, like a leader. Looks proved to be deceiving. Harding would prove to be morally and intellectually weak, and Wilson actually survived to see Harding's funeral. The historian Kevin Phillips, in his book The Politics of Rich and Poor, describes a series of cycles in American history: reform, war, then reaction, including the 1920s, which he described as a period of Republican overdrive, reduced role for government, difficulties for labor, the growth of big business, tax reduction, deflation, tough times for agriculture, concentration of wealth, and increased personal debt and speculation are all characteristics of the politics of the 1920s and this era of Republican overdrive. And certainly, President Warren G. Harding is a big part of creating those conditions. So let's talk a little bit about his life and career leading up to the presidency, which, as they always do, play a role in his actions as president. Harding was born in 1865 in Ohio and underwent a modest education. His mother was a convert to the Seventh-day Adventist faith, providing Harding a fundamentalist background. He really wasn't much of an intellectual. I mentioned his modest education. He spent his youth swimming, playing baseball, playing with animals, and so on. And generally he had a small-town mindset about things. He did graduate from a teaching college and prepared for a career as a rural school teacher. But he didn't enjoy rural teaching. Ended up changing jobs several times. He sold insurance for a while and finally bought a newspaper, the Marion Star. And the newspaper was successful and expanded under his guidance. In 1891, he married Florence Kling, nicknamed the Duchess, who proved to be a difficult person, and their marriage suffered through some problems. While she was an effective organizer and advocate for his career, she could also be ungraceful and sharp-tongued, and their marriage suffered. In fact, Harding spent time in a sanatorium 5 times between 1890 and 1902 for varying degrees of mental issues and fatigue, part of which was contributed to insecurity derived over the rumors that he was at least partly black, and also his marriage problems and some business problems contributed to his insecurity. As his newspaper, the Marion Star, continued to grow, so did the importance of its editor, and the news business prepared Harding for a career in politics. He also benefited from a considerable degree of small-town charm and cooperation, friendship, and local pride, and a budding array of networking and connections that really advanced his early political career. In 1899, he won his first elected office, a state senate seat, and he became known as a conciliator within the extremely divisive atmosphere of Ohio politics. And actually, Ohio is, even now it remains, of course, an important swing state politically, but in the era of this course, Ohio may have been the most important state in the Union in terms of politics. He was reelected to the state senate in 1901, and then in 1903 elected lieutenant governor of Ohio. After returning to Marion and his newspaper for a time, he was elected U.S. Senator for Ohio in 1914. He really didn't have much opportunity to make a great name for himself as a junior senator, and he wasn't particularly renowned, generally following the crowd and notching only few noteworthy moments as a senator. He tended to swim with the majority on the key issues of the day, such as women's voting, immigration, the Red Scare, and even the League of Nations. Harding found himself a presidential candidate in 1920 almost by accident. As a senator from Ohio, he was a natural factor in national politics. His reputation as a conciliator helped within a Republican Party that was very much divided. As such, other candidates struggled to secure a majority, and so eventually they turned to a dark horse. At the convention, there was deadlock between the frontrunners, Frank Loudon and General Leonard Wood, whom you might remember we discussed as a fierce anti-immigrant advocate at that time. Harding's campaign manager, Harry Doherty, said, "When both realize they can't win, when they're hot and sweaty and discouraged, they will remember me and this little headquarters. They'll be like soldiers after a battle who recall a shady spring along a country road where they got a drink as they marched to the front. When they remember me that way, maybe both sides will turn to Harding." He continued, "I don't expect Senator Harding to be nominated on the first, second, or third ballot, but I think we can well afford to take chances that about 11 minutes after 2 o'clock on Friday morning at the convention, when 15 or 20 men, somewhat weary, are sitting around a table, some one of them will say, 'Who will we nominate?' At that decisive time, the friends of Senator Harding can suggest him and can afford to abide by the result." In fact, Doherty was right, and Harding won the nomination. Harding's running mate was Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, whom I already mentioned at one point had made a name for himself after the Boston police strike. Harding defeated James Cox, who was also a newspaperman from Ohio, in fact, governor of Ohio at that point. His running mate was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So it's interesting to note that in this election there were 3 future presidents headlining the 2 tickets. Woodrow Wilson, who of course remained president during the campaign, insisted that the Democrats focus on the League of Nations as the central issue. Labor unrest and the Red Scare inspired a desire for change for some. Harding capitalized on this opening. He campaigned for peace. He remained relatively subdued and gave speeches mostly from his front porch. But he was very likable at this time. So, many people voted for Harding due to any number of these reasons. They were tired of the war. He was likable. This represented a vote against Woodrow Wilson. The Red Scare, a return to simpler times and rural values. As Harding said, America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy. In fact, it was an astonishing victory for Harding on November 2nd, winning more than 16 million votes to just about 9 million for Cox. Now that is a landslide and a mandate. Harding is routinely rated among our very worst presidents. This is mostly a result of scandals and corruption among his appointees, not necessarily his own doing, many of which came to light after his death. He did actually make some quality appointments of significant officials. He appointed Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, also Andrew W. Mellon, the Pittsburgh banking magnate, as Secretary of Treasury, and both of these oversaw a soaring economy throughout the 20s. Other appointments were less auspicious. Albert Fall, the senator from New Mexico and a personal friend of Harding, was appointed Secretary of Interior. His campaign manager and friend, Harry Doherty, was named Attorney General. These and some other of his officials became involved in some of the biggest scandals in the history of the White House up to that point. The Harding administration was much different from Wilson's. Harding was affable and likable and threw open the doors of the White House. Mrs. Harding reinstated White House teas and garden parties, and Harding had an excellent working relationship with the press. He was gregarious, likable, and handsome, very charismatic. But he was human as well. He had his frailties. He had a temper. He was trusting to a fault and very loyal to his appointees. Some of his habits drew scrutiny to the White House and to his record. He liked to play poker, although the poker crowd never ran the government, as some historians have claimed. He also liked to play golf, although he didn't squander as many hours at it as others have claimed. His habit of drinking and smoking was more questionable. He liked to smoke and occasionally chew tobacco, and his drinking actually became more of an issue because he claimed to support prohibition and its enforcement, but secretly drank himself and didn't pursue prohibition with any real vigor. This combination of drinking, smoking, and card playing combined to undermine the image of this president, and in light of the later scandals, have dragged down his memory among historians. Harding is also a stark contrast to Wilson because he wasn't especially intellectual. His thinking was undisciplined, and he often chose to accept the advice or word of others rather than trying to trouble through issues on his own. He often spoke in cliches, maxims, and opinions. He didn't like philosophical discussions or technical matters, or economic theory and the like. One fault of his presidency is that even though he did have some thoroughly capable people working under him, their own efforts bottlenecked with him as the executive branch struggled to act. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the episodes of the Harding presidency in more detail, and we'll look at a few things more closely. For the moment, let me just mention a few general trends and themes of his presidency. Harding really wasn't much interested in foreign affairs. Again, he didn't have the temperament or the patience to think much about the rest of the world. In his own words, he wanted to put our own house in order. He wanted to increase tariff barriers and lower domestic taxes. He also wanted a national budget, help for farmers, and he sought an anti-lynching law. So, in the next lecture, we'll talk about these and other policies and initiatives. We'll see how the record actually stands up to what Harding proposed.